Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range technical forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. So I flashed this earlier this week in the U.S. Global Update video that came out on Monday morning, and we talked about the latest seasonal outlook here from the European model favoring, once again, this is another month's runs, favoring the wetter conditions in parts of Western Canada, getting into the Pacific Northwest and the northern half of the Rocky Mountains here. We also were projecting a decent storm track through the Ohio River Valley out of the Mid-South, and also possibly quite a few clipper systems that come through like this through the Canadian Prairie, through the Northwest, and then run through the Great Lakes through Ontario into Quebec. The problem is this pattern is so dominated by the developing La Nina that it's also not forecasting a strong subtropical component to the jet stream, which is why we see the models favoring drier across the southern tier of the United States. In terms of temperatures, the source of cold air in the models will likely be here, where the models continue to kind of forecast, troughing in this area throughout much of winter. So the jet stream is going to have to do this. All right. And if it does that, that's going to tend to keep the southern part of the United States with overall warmer than average conditions. Now, remember, when we look at these maps, this is a 3-month average. So this is what we would expect if the model was 100% correct. We would expect for December, January, and February to look like when you just average all of those days together. We know that these models, have caveats. They're not perfect, and they're really heavily based on their initial conditions. And also, the long-range forecasts are really dependent on ocean temperature patterns. And again, this is very much a La Nina pattern if we've ever seen one. But what I want to add to it is some new data that just came out yesterday from the National Multi-Model Ensemble. So this is a group of models run in the United States. It includes things like the CFSV2, NASA's GFDL model, stuff like that. And what we've got here is a very similar pattern. Look there in the Pacific Northwest, Western Canada. Look out of the Ohio River Valley, coming through the Great Lakes and into Ontario and Quebec, and as well as the drier conditions that we just talked about from ECMWF, well, they're showing up here as well. And then the colder air center, right in the same place with that trough that the models are projecting to be more of a permanent factor here this winter. And so if there's a source of cold air, the NMME says, hey, it's going to be coming out of that region as well, with more than likely featuring more warmer days than cooler days compared to average across the south. Now, as I said, most of these forecasts are going to be really dependent on the ocean temperature pattern. So this is the most dominant thing that's controlling this. It's going to be the trade wind fluctuations, the shifts in what we call the Walker cell, and how this ultimately affects the position and movement of the jet stream. A couple of things to be discussing. Some of the new forecast model runs from all of our modeling centers are trying to push the peak of this La Nina a little later than I had initially forecast. So as we talked about, maybe getting this into January, maybe the middle and end of January before it starts to fade back toward neutral. But it does appear, according to some of the latest stuff here, that we'll still be dealing with very weak La Nina conditions into spring, and we will, of course, be talking about that in the coming months here. Do notice we stay quite warm in the North Pacific, which would support more of that ridging here before the atmosphere dives into a trough like this across Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest. So that's just some more supportive evidence of what's going on there. Currently, our La Nina has really taken those trade winds and shoved them pretty far to the west here. And as a consequence of that extension of the trade winds, we have seen a little bit of a shift overall in the strength of this La Nina. After bottoming out here at the end of October at -1.5 degrees Celsius, we've now bounced back up closer to -1. This is still a strong La Nina, and it does extend pretty far to the south in the southern hemisphere. But those shifts are important because there's an interplay between that shift in the trade winds and also what's going on with the MJO. And I'd like to talk about that a bit. So we spent so much of the month of October over here in phase 4 and 5. Again, that was a source for some of the drought conditions in Brazil, but then the MJO really got going and has now moved basically to right here into phase 1. And it's going to come out, phase 8. It's going to come out into phase 1 and then over into phase 2. And it appears to be getting kind of blocked up here in phase 2 as we look out longer term. Now, what does all that mean? Well, if you look here, you see the reds I'm going to circle, and then the blues over here. Now, if you were looking down on top of this, this would say that the winds were coming strongly, I'll draw that in white, strongly out of the east here, and strongly out of the west there in the low levels of the atmosphere. So all of our best rising motion is going to be right in the middle in between. And that particular region globally, well, that's over here in phase 4 and 5. Now, if we just kind of follow this area, what you notice is that with time, it's slid. And now those strong westerlies are here. The strong easterlies are there. And now the best rising motion is sitting in this area. And that is sitting right here over phase 1 and 2. And what some of the models, let me draw that again. What some of the models are suggesting is we're going to continue to see it stay in that place for quite some time. So if it stays here, the correlation between the temperature pattern across North America in phase 1 and 2 tends to be more of the cold air kind of tucked in this area, occasionally getting kind of let out into the southern plains. But it still seems to favor more warmth east and cold in the northwest and the Canadian prairie. Keep that in mind because that's going to be critical to this pattern. Adding to that is what's going on deep in the troposphere and into the stratosphere. So right now, when looking at where the polar vortex sits, it's currently sitting somewhere in this vicinity, right over the Chukchi Sea and over Alaska and over the Bering Sea. That is also where we have low sea ice extent at this point as well. Now, currently, the polar vortex, represented by the Arctic Oscillation, is strong. We can see that by looking at the winds at that level. So if I draw on this graphic over here on the right, what I just highlighted for you here would be the strongest we could get the polar vortex, and here would be the weakest. Average is right here. Now where we're currently sitting, I'll circle it, is right in this vicinity. What we want to watch out for, interseasonal fluctuations in something like the Arctic Oscillation, would be if it all of a sudden just plummeted way down here into a very weak state. You see, if it did that, that would allow the Arctic Oscillation to go negative. That would allow the polar vortex to weaken, and cold air would spill somewhere in the following 2 to 6 weeks. But at this point, it seems to be staying up there in positive territory. And the Arctic Oscillation, well, here's the zero line right here. You can see that the forecast in the European model is to really keep this above that, which means that we expect to see the polar vortex staying strong. And remember, that is a key to locking the cold air in somewhere. So the upper levels of the atmosphere are kind of giving us clues as to where that is. Here's the jet stream flow. Remember, that jet stream is going to mark off where the strongest contrast is in temperatures. And it's right here coming out of the Arctic over Alaska and the warmth that's farther to the south. And so as a result of this, this is where our cold air is going to continue to source from, and the troughs are going to source from. Now, if we go down lower in the atmosphere, let's just take a look at the flow today. High pressure sitting off the coast. You can see the flow coming around it like that. We then have here coming off of the continent, flow in this direction, that front that just swept through here. And as it came through, it's kind of stalling out a bit. And it's feeding off that moisture there, also from the north end of soon to be, I believe it has actually now been upgraded back to hurricane status on Eta. We've kind of been waffling back and forth between tropical storm and hurricane strength. So what this is going to mean as we look out in the near term, well, it appears that Eta is going to get pulled around that high and take off in a direction like this. We'll take a look at that precipitation in a few moments. This is Theta. Theta is moving here actually over eventually toward the Iberian Peninsula, but also the National Hurricane Center has given this area in through here an 80% chance of developing. And if it does, it would be named Iota. From there, I would like to show you support for that. Talking about the MJO getting stuck in phase 1-2, look at the rising motion here for the next 15 days right in this part of the Indian Ocean. And over here, where we have the complement to that, is going to be over the Caribbean and northern parts of Brazil, which is going to be critical to that northern Brazil rainfall coming up. But this is what it looks like when the MJO gets stuck. Instead of slanting these colors like this, which would mean it would have this kind of counterclockwise progression around that phase diagram, it's relatively just straight up and down. And that's why we're going to be seeing a relatively stagnant pattern coming out of the tropics in the near term. So we then turn our attention to the extratropics. We now look toward the pole. What we have to watch out for this time of year is blocking right here. Big ridges that somehow either come from Scandinavia, they come from the Hudson Bay, Greenland, or Alaska, big ridges that get into that area. And if we see more troughing in there, that tends to indicate a more relaxed pattern and warmth across the lower 48. What I keep seeing here, though, is that this seems to be a source region for where troughs continue to form, and they keep kind of getting let out here across the western part of the United States. Let me show what I'm talking about. Playing this forward, I'm going to pause it right here, which is getting toward the end of this week. Now, as we do that, there is a deep trough that came out of, came out of the Bering Sea in this area and is now diving into the Pacific Northwest, and it is a monster that's coming through here. It's going to bring big snows to the northwest, and it's going to slide through, and eventually by the time we get into early next week, kick off a big storm system over the Great Lakes. But after that goes through, look, we still have troughing in this area. This is an unblocked pattern. In fact, you can count the spokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And with that, we expect to see movement. And what ends up happening is we get out here to like 17th, 18th of November, and now we got a big ridge, and the next trough comes in while we reset the pattern here over the Arctic, over the Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. See, that seems to be the way things continue to set up. Now, to put this into context, especially as precipitation moves forward, this is looking at the top meter, so the top 3 feet in terms of soil moisture percentile. And there are a few areas that just recently have been quite dry when you look at the full depth of that profile. It's dry in through here, it's dry in the central and northern plains, and we're really missing out on precipitation in parts of California as well, which is why this region's dry. So what are we going to get out of this? Well, as that system comes in on Friday, big time precipitation maker from Northern California through coastal Oregon and Washington. Several feet of snow coming into the Cascades. I'll show you that in a few moments. But after that comes through, it's not going to re-intensify until the low starts to form here and then come together over the Great Lakes. So therefore, much of the Central Plains, even getting into a lot of the Corn Belt, relatively dry through the next week or so. What you've got down here, well, this is the flow around that high today, adding into the moisture that'll be coming from Eta, and you're putting down quite a bit of precipitation from the Carolinas through the mid-Atlantic, including Virginia. Now, what the big system will look like by the time we get to Sunday, here it is. And this time of year, I always think about one of my favorite songs from Gordon Lightfoot, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And certainly this is one of those big Lake Superior storm systems. And you can see how tight the pressure gradient is around this. Again, this is Sunday afternoon. It's going to drag another cold front through this area, really cool things off. How about snow? Well, as that system goes through, we can see what the models are projecting here, coming through parts of Ontario, getting over into Quebec. And then, as we said, as that whole system starts this Friday coming into the northwest, a lot of snow being picked up here in the Cascades and the Northern Rockies. Where it's not being added is farther to the south, because the flow is just not strong enough out of the west through California. Will it ever get there? It doesn't look like it will. By day 10, this is the 21st, look, our next trough resets. It then moves through day 15 to here, and overall we tend to see our pattern across much of the lower 48 here, and the ensembles, it's zonal, it's relatively benign. So let's put that into the context of the week 2 precipitation pattern, all right? So this is only week 2. We see here generally not major anomalies one way or the other, right? You can see maybe some wetter conditions in the Central Plains, but dry in the southeast to the northeast. And we're going to watch as these systems come into the west, really increasing our chances for precipitation here. Again, this stretches all the way out into week 2. Temperature-wise, we have had the start of November extremely warm temperatures just until recently and through this area. And everywhere that you see the number 1, that's the warmest start to November over the last 128 years. Now that front swept through, and if you look at the change in temperature from yesterday midday to today at midday on Wednesday, you can find the front and look at how much colder it is on the back side of this. Some places 30 to almost 40 degrees cooler than average. When that front came through, it certainly kicked off some nasty severe weather in northern Illinois. Several reports here of very, very strong winds on the northern edge of that squall line. But it did move through and temperatures have cooled off. So here's your Wednesday highs. Let's go through this pretty quickly. We're looking now into Thursday and Friday. Now we get out to Saturday. There's a brief warm-up coming into the midsection of the country here, but this is out ahead of that big system on Sunday that goes through the Great Lakes states. So here's the warm out ahead of it, and there's some cooler air that comes in behind it, as you see on Monday. But generally, the temperature pattern isn't nearly as extreme as it had been over the last, several weeks here. And going now out into the day 5 through 10 time period, remember, we're kind of resetting the cold at that point. And as I told you, the pattern goes flatter, which means we see warmer conditions in the models here as the first round of cool air exits the East Coast. And then you go from there into the 10 to 15 day. And once again, I told you, it's going to be rewatching the lows take shape over Alaska. The GFS is way more progressive with it than the European. See the difference in temperatures here. But they both are favoring warmth. So to finish this up, I just want to show you by day 15, we still see that same feature. All the way out here to December the 5th, it still seems to be there. We keep kicking these systems through the northwest. And because of that, our long-term temperature pattern is really favoring warmth here with all the cold in place in this area. Now I'm going to tell you, this forecast will be wrong if any of these things happens over the next couple of weeks, like the Arctic Oscillation collapses and goes back below zero, or the MJO moves into phase 3-4. That'll also affect South America. Or what if we start to get rid of the big block over the North Pole, or the North Pacific jet stream stops screaming through here and moves? Those things are hard to forecast beyond just 10 to 15 days, so we want to watch for them. If they do change, the pattern that we just talked about won't verify. But I'll just tell you this, the last several runs of the European model and the new GFS Extended are all giving us this same look as we look out to the last week of November and the first week of December, possibly a milder go of it here across the eastern half of North America. I think the ticket to understanding this pattern will be in the ice concentration, the temperature gradients, and therefore the pattern in terms of troughs and ridges over the pole. That's where our blocking is going to set up, and that's what we're going to watch. Okay, got through it. I just wanted to make sure we saw what this near-term pattern was and get a fresh look at some of the long-range stuff for December, January, February. Wrap it up here and talk to you in the morning, okay? Have a good one. Thanks.